One of the masterpieces that our God is involved in is making something out of clay. Now, when we read in Genesis chapter 1, we read that God took Adam and formed him out of the dust of the ground. So God took Adam and he took him out of the dust and he formed him. It actually says that he started making him. He didn't say a word and Adam appeared. Adam, he started forming. I'm not going to make an Adam out of this clay, no matter how much I'm going to try. But he formed him, so he worked with him. Now, when Adam was found to be alone, Adam was found to be alone, God took a piece from Adam, right? He took a rib out of Adam, and he created Eve out of that. So he took, and so we got Eve here. Well, not as well, but she's still from the dust of the ground. She's not a square. But he took him and he put him together. He started putting them together. He said, the two shall become one flesh. Okay, now, this is a process. To make two pieces of clay come together, you really have to smack this clay down. Now, how many of you guys have gone through this process of getting smacked down in your marriage? Trying to put the two pieces together, and they don't always fit, and so it just keeps going and going, and you really have to work with this. And it's a long process. And now this clay is pre-made, so it's made to form quite quickly. But the clay that they use, the one that they get, it's a long, long process that they go through bending it, breaking it down until it becomes one, where you can't distinguish between the two. Okay, some of you guys played with Play-Doh, right? How many of you guys played with Play-Doh before? Everybody? Кто играл с Play-Doh? А кто до сих пор играет с Play-Doh? До сих пор есть некоторые, у кого дети уже начинают подрастать, они играют с Play-Doh. И вы знаете, когда смешаешь Play-Doh весь, разные цвета, то их уже потом расценить очень трудно, да? И просто ты их уже так оставляешь, потому что уже расценить. Well, that's one flesh, if you get the picture. Now, all of this he puts into one flesh. Now, how many of you guys will say after I've done this, когда я это сделал, кто скажет, что это masterpiece? It looks like a masterpiece? Probably the best I can do that. But it's not a masterpiece. And you're right. Это не masterpiece. Это не шедевр. It's not. So what does God do? God starts using tools in our life to start creating a masterpiece from this piece of clay. Now, all of these works right here, I am not a professional, so I'll tell you right now. Я не профессионал, но это все я, что мог сделать, сделал. Я раньше чуть-чуть делал. This was my last one. It got a little broken as I was carrying it here. But it's not perfect. It's not perfect. There's a little broken pieces here, and I went too far in the bottom, and I have a hole here. You're not supposed to have a hole, because what happens if you put water in there? I'm not a good potter. Okay, I'll tell you right away. But our God is a perfect potter. He actually compares that when we read in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 18. He says, go to the potter and learn. He tells Jeremiah to do that. So I want us to go to the potter and see what God can make out of us. Now, right away, I already have a problem. I haven't worked with a big piece of clay like this. Usually it's like half the size of this. But again, husband and wife together, it becomes big. Now, we're going to take this potter's wheel that I brought here, and we're going to try to make a pot. This is what God does. Now, think of this. This is you and your spouse, your marriage. The first thing that the potter has to do is he has to throw the clay. So he has to throw it. And sometimes we feel in our marriage that God has thrown us and we're on our own. But we actually don't understand that we're actually going to a next level, or we're going to the next step. We've been melded together, and now he has to throw it. It has to throw it so it doesn't move. Because if it moves, I won't be able to do anything. Now, to center it, he's going to have to start working with the clay. I have to get his hands dirty. I'm going to have to take off my wedding ring. Sorry, honey. This has to come off. Because it's going to mess up the clay. If you use a little metal, it's going to make rivets in the clay. So what you need, and this is actually very, very important, you need to get the clay centered before you make anything from it. Now, that's important in our lives because we have to be in the center of God's will for God to do anything with us. For God to create a masterpiece from our marriage, we have to be in the center of God's will. And that takes some water, and it has to be always lubricated. Water is what's going to help to make this into a masterpiece. And I equate that to the love that you have in marriage. You have to have water for your marriage to work. If I started spinning this without any water, I would not form anything at all. It would just be going through my hands, and it would be a very hard time. It would be a lot of friction, and nothing would be formed without water. Just friction. And so many times our marriages, we're married, we're one flesh, and then we get on the wheel, and all we have is friction. There's no love in our marriage. And we need to have love in our marriage. And you take that water, and you constantly have to apply it, and you have to now force it to go into the center. And you have to force it. And this is where the hard part comes. And with this big piece of clay, this is a big piece of clay. Well, for me, I am not a professional, like I said. I'm going to try to force it. So I did this one a couple days ago, but you could see it's much smaller. Much smaller. That was half the size of this. So I'm going to try to do this. So if I mess up, bear with me. But remember that you and your marriage is in the master's potter's hands. And he can do it perfectly. Now I'm going to start applying pressure. And you guys all know what pressure is like in marriage. Or am I the only one? You guys know what pressure is in marriage. I'm the only one? But I'm always going to be constantly applying water. Because right now, as I push it in, the water gets soaked up into the clay, and then it dries up, and I'm getting friction. And when you get friction, it's harder to bend the clay. Don't mind the bucket. I took it from my daughters. Now what I'm trying to do, as I'm working with this clay, is I'm going to try to push it up. And some of you guys that took pottery class probably remember this. It's called coning. So I'm pushing in the sides. Now sometimes we have ups in our marriages, some good times. And it's good. Those good times are good. And then God has to bring those good times. He brings some challenging times, and He has to push us down. But it's interesting, in the potter's wheel, those times when they are pushed down, when the clay is being pushed down, that is when it most gets centered. It doesn't get centered when you push it up. It gets centered when you push it down. Now I have to get this clay centered if I want to make anything from it. Because right now it's all wobbly. If you could see it, it's wobbling. If I try to make anything right now, it's going to break. And the potter knows that the clay is not ready. It's wobbling, and it's not going to be formed. Nothing's going to get made out of it. It will fall apart if I try to make anything. So I'm going to be pushing this clay until I get it centered. There's a lot of excess stuff that comes off. Now this is everything that does not help it get centered. It's actually in the way of getting it centered. And those things need to be removed. I have to remove all of that if I want it centered. Now there are some things in our marriages that need to be put away. They are not letting us to be in the center of God's will. And this weekend, you're going to have the opportunity to think about that, to consider those things that are maybe present in your marriages that need to be put away. I don't know what it might be, but God will put it on your heart to think and see what needs to be put away in my marriage so that I can be in the center of God's will. So I'm going to go up. Up and down until I get it centered. Sometimes this clay is very stubborn. Sometimes that's how we are in marriage, huh? Now it's not perfectly centered. If you probably don't see it, but right here from the top, it's close to center. But it's still wobbly a little bit, and that has to do with the wheel. The wheel is a little off-centered. And so I'm going to try so we don't spend all our evening looking at me doing pottery, because I think that would be a little boring. But I'm going to try to make, again, I say the word try to make some kind of masterpiece. Well, maybe by my standards. Maybe not yours, but we'll see. So the next step that you do is you want to go to the center. So you're gonna cave it in so you could start forming something. And this process, you take your fingers and you start pushing down on the center. Now, if you see a lot of it going away, that's because there's no lubrication. It gets sticky. You got to always lubricate it. And like we said, lubrication is that love in our marriage. We have to have that love so God could do something with us. That love between us. Now we made this hole. Now we're going to push off to the sides. You might not see it, but I'm going to try to pull it. And then we start making the walls, and that's where the masterpiece happens. And we're going to try to build up these walls of whatever masterpiece is going to come out to. So this is called pulling in pottery. Sometimes God stretches us and pulls us in a different direction that we thought we weren't supposed to go or didn't want to go, but God starts pulling us. Because He has a specific, like the potter usually, now I'm not a professional potter, but the potter has a purpose in mind already for what pot he wants to make. So he has an idea. So for instance, I need a pitcher, or I need a jar, I need a vase. And he starts making that. And he's going to work with this clay until that is formed. Now I just started making it. I'm just thinking what's going to happen as long as it doesn't break. So I'm hoping it doesn't break. But sometimes that does happen. And it's interesting, the potter will not throw that clay away. Usually it's called recycling. We all know what that is in Washington. But he recycles that clay. But it's interesting, if this pot falls apart, that clay that I took, I'm going to have to let it dry for a little bit. It's going to be too saturated with water, and I won't be able to pull a pot with it because it's going to be too wet. I'm going to have to let it dry for a little bit, then I'll have to restart on it. It's called recycling the clay. But we're going to try to pull something off of this masterpiece. Now that could be... You guys ready for this? I'm not. Thank you. It fell because it was not centered completely. It was a big piece of clay that I wasn't able to center it in the time I had. And so when it's not centered and you try to pull it, there's weak sides that become evident after the pull. You don't see the weak sides when it was a mountain like that. It looked like a solid piece of mountain you're ready to work with. But if it's not centered, you start pulling that, you're going to see that weakness right away. And that weakness happened to be right there. And it became top heavy. I had too much clay on the top, not enough on the bottom, and it broke. It got too heavy and it went down. Okay, and that's what happens when we are not centered on Christ. When our marriage is not centered on Christ, we're going to try to do something and it's going to fall through because we weren't centered. Okay, but if we're centered, then God starts doing something, and then God starts pulling us in a direction, and we're ready to go in that direction because we're in the center of God's will. And we start going that direction, and we know what's going on there, and then those weaknesses, we don't see them because God is covering that. He took care of that. You were centered in His will. And He has a purpose for every marriage. He has a purpose. He's trying to make a masterpiece. Okay? Now the point of this is that the clay sometimes becomes stubborn. The clay does not want to change. The clay has a lot of things that need to be taken out there. And the potter will push that clay. He will bring up those highs, put them down again, and do that until it gets centered. Remove all that waste that doesn't need to be there. And then you could become a masterpiece. Are you guys ready to be a masterpiece in the potter's hands? Amen. Do you want your marriages to be a masterpiece in God's hands? That's what we're here for. I want you guys to start focusing on that. How can my marriage become this masterpiece in God's hands? Right now we're going to hear a song from our group. And after that, we'll have Pastor Wayne Johnson. he's going to bring the first message here, the importance of love in our marriages. So let's hear a song out, and then Pastor Wayne Johnson will be your time.